Federalist 10, we're done with that. Federalist 51, we're good. And now we're moving on to the third of our four Federalist papers. And if you missed class or you need to hear it a second time, we're going to break down Federalist paper number 70. So starting with the basics, the executive department further considered is an essay written by Alexander Hamilton arguing for a single robust executive provided for in the United States Constitution. And it was published in March of 1788. And hopefully by now you understand the Federalist Papers were persuasive essays attempting to win the minds and the hearts of the people regarding the Constitution, that there is a need for a strong federal Constitution. Hopefully you got that by now. And the argument for the Federalists is a pretty simple one. They felt there should be one single executive. Now, nowadays we call that person the president. Now, the anti-Federalists were a little concerned by this because bear in mind, the Revolutionary War was fresh in people's minds and they felt, hey, listen, if we have one executive, that is reminiscent of a king and we don't want a king. We just went through a lot of hullabaloo to get rid of a king. So you can kind of understand where the anti-Federalists were coming from in the context of the time. So here's the question. Why have one person in charge of the executive branch? So according to Federalist 70, they said it was based on two things, unity and responsibility. And I'm going to read a quote from Federalist 70. That unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number. And in proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished. So what they mean by that, if you have one person in charge, that's one-stop shopping. You don't have to go through the confusion and the bureaucracy. You can unite the executive into one person. That's the unity piece. And then in terms of responsibility, if something goes wrong, there is someone to blame immediately, not all this finger pointing. Around here, the Flint water crisis, there was a lot of finger pointing at the local level, to the state level, to the federal level, to the corporation that, handled the pipes. And it was a mess because there was a lot of parties involved. If you have one party involved, it's pretty simple. Responsibility lands upon that person's shoulders. And think about it. In times of emergency, one person can act quicker than a group with multiple people. So if our classroom was on fire, would you expect me to be the HMIC and say, you go here, you do this, you do this? I wouldn't say, hi, everybody, the school's on fire. Let's get into a committee and discuss our options. There's a time and a place for immediate action. And the Federalist paper number 70 is saying one person can act a lot better. Responsibility can rest in that person's hands. So hopefully you get that. And in terms of what's the most important thing for this person, energy. Not an answer you would probably expect. And here's a quote from Federalist 70. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. And I think you get this, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, government, we're only as good as our leader, okay? And probably a scale that you can understand, principle of the school. If we have a high energy, high character person, the whole school gets better. If we have a low energy, low character person, the school gets worse. And that really applies at all levels. I think you can understand that concept. So let me give you an example when it's done well. Let me reinforce where the Federalists were coming from. Two events in our history, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, dark days in our history. The very next day after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, President Roosevelt was on top of things. He didn't have to go through a lot of, bureaucracy and red tape to take care of business. President Bush did it even better. 9/11 happened in the morning. He was talking to the country by the evening. So in a sense, this is more validation that the Federalist had the more compelling argument. That's an example. So I know some of you are thinking, hey, what about history? History, multiple leaders, one leader. So it can go either way. It depends on how you want to argue it. So if you were a decent history student, you alluded to the triumvirates of Rome. Now, they tried it twice. They didn't work. They did not work. So the Federalists could say, hey, anti-Federalists, this idea of having 3 presidents or 5 presidents or 7 presidents, whatever, history has shown, the Romans have shown, it doesn't exactly work. And here's one that's not in Federalist 70, but another historical argument you can make for those who are good in history. Right before the Reformation, one of Martin Luther's concerns was political corruption that was occurring with three popes. It was one of the reasons behind the Reformation. Obviously, the selling of indulgences was the biggie, but three popes, he was not real happy about that either. Okay, so let me take it away from history. Some of you are saying, hey, I'm not much of a history person. I don't remember too much. I didn't have Salsiccioli for history, so I don't know as much. And I'm just kidding. Any of our teachers, you learn this. I'm just messing with you. So even on a personal scale, when you have multiple leaderships, it gets very vague, it's very ambiguous. So you could talk about two parents. If you have one parent telling you one thing and the other parent telling you the other, it is quite confusing. In a sense, you need to have one parent be the decision maker, or at least both of them being on the same page. I've run into this problem before in the past when a student has a really heavy essay, big, great essay, and they give me the essay and, hey, how can you proofread it? Can you give me advice? I hear from other teachers, they say, hey, did you talk to this student about this? I don't want him to do it this way. And the really conscientious students will take their paper to maybe 5 or 6 teachers and they get really confused. Who's right? I don't even know who's right. Oh my goodness. Okay, here, for future reference, whoever's grading the paper, that's the person you talk to. But I've run into trouble with this because kids are getting mixed messages, okay? Multiple team captains. Now, being a coach, in the past, I might have had 2 captains. One is a real, kind of mean, you got to do it like this. You have to do it like this. And the other one's like, it's okay, do your own thing. You're fine. And the kid is confused because which captain do I listen to, or multiple bosses? You get messages from multiple bosses that don't match. So in a sense, did the Federalists have a valid argument, between history and these kind of anecdotal things in your everyday life? Do you get where they were coming from? The saying, hey, one executive is where it's at. Okay, now for those who are contrarian, or those who like to argue, or those who still fail to see the Federalist side of the argument, they can say, hey, listen, you want to use Rome, the triumvirates? How about Caligula? How about Nero? I mean, we had lunatics running the biggest empire in the world. And you could counter with that saying we probably had one of history's greatest leaders, Marcus Aurelius. But it's a false equivalence because, in a sense, America is not ancient Rome. America has some stopgaps in place. We have some plans in our Constitution that would avoid, hopefully, a Caligula and a Nero and more Marcus Aurelius type leaders. Okay, so according to a bunch of historians' lists, the best president and the worst president. By the way, if you're looking for recent presidents, we give them a little time before we make that decision. But according to the majority of lists, Abraham Lincoln is the greatest president in history, or was the greatest president in history, and James Buchanan was the worst. So I'm not saying he's as bad as Caligula or Nero, or he was Marcus Aurelius, but here, closer to now than ancient Rome. Great leader, lousy leader. But let's look at America right now, which I think buttresses the Federalist argument. So if you look at the president, the people vote for them. So that's stopgap number 1. They have to win over the people. Number 2, 4-year terms, and now you can only be president for 8 years. Okay. By the way, if you don't do well in your first term, you'll get voted out by the people. That's stopgap number 2. Impeachment. If the executive fails to do the right things or violates the rules, they can be impeached by Congress. Congressional overrides of vetoes. This is number 4 now. If the president is really a bozo and the people want this legislation, the Congress can override the executive. And the cabinet appointments. The president's group has to be approved by the Senate. So, in a sense, these 5 items reinforces the Federalist argument that they were correct. And if you think about it, if the Anti-Federalists got what they wanted, would it be a very different country? Would it be a better country? I don't know. And here's another thing. There's a time and a place to move slow, a time and a place to move quick. So in Federalist 70, they say, hey, the legislative branch, there's committees, and then you have the House, and then you have to take it to the Senate, and they work it out. It's slow, it's methodical, but the executive branch allows us to work very quickly. So, the executive branch, the president, there is a time and a place that you have to act decisively. The legislative branch is a little more methodical, a little more cautious. So we have these distinctions in the branches, and the Federalist paper is saying, hey, listen, we understand there's a lot of power in one person's hands, and we understand that they can act quickly. However, the legislative branch, as a contrast, will handle matters that are a little bit slower. I'll give you an example for me as a teacher. Curriculum. If I'm planning a year's curriculum or working with my coworkers, it's going to take a little bit to hammer out a curriculum or a pacing guide we can all agree with. There's a time and a place as a teacher I need to move immediately. Okay, I have to do it right there on the spot. That would be the executive branch. Okay, so I am impressed with you. You're getting better with each Federalist paper. We only have one more to go, Federalist 78, and then we'll move on to something else. So I do appreciate your effort, and hopefully this explained it, and thank you for watching.